Okay, welcome back, and I'm going to hand over to the chair of this panel, Professor Walter Horton. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Wando for inviting me to chair this panel. I will be brief with my introductions just to save time at the end for questions. And as I've reminded the panel, we have a timekeeper in the back who will hold up a big sign at the 15-minute mark. And I will get going then. Our first speaker today is Dr. Medina Cham. Dr. Cham is an assistant professor of history at New York University. Her writing has appeared in the Codesria Bulletin, Journal of African History, Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History, and Islamic Africa, among other venues. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled The Inland Shore: An Intimate History of the West African Sahel. Welcome.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear, including in the back? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you so much to the organizers for gathering here today. Us here today has been a great conference so far, and I really look forward to the rest of the discussions. So my talk today, I hope I didn't overpromise in the abstract, although I may have, because it's something that I'm still very much in the beginning of working on, and so I'll be very happy actually to get some questions and feedback to help me shape my thinking. I'll just get started. So it's titled From Mecca to Jamaica, an intimate experience of West Africa and the world. West Africa and the world being the theme of our panel. And I will start with a story. So on September 9th, 1834, a man by the name of Edward Dulin appeared before a thick crowd that had filled the public office of Judge Richard Robert Madden in Kingston, Jamaica. They had gathered that day to witness Edward Dulin's manumission. As the proceedings carried on, emotions were running high in the room. People of all complexions, black and white attendees, were deeply moved, some even shedding tears of joy. Eventually, the judge and the formerly enslaved man affixed their signatures at the bottom of the manumission certificate, and the document officially declared Edward Dulin, quote, absolutely and utterly free, unquote. Edward Dulin, whose manumission occurred that day, was born about 40 years prior in Timbuktu and raised in Djenné in the Niger-Ben region of the Sahel, which you see right here on the map, Djenné and Timbuktu, along with other cities that he's passed through on his journey. So following his upbringing and his early years in Timbuktu and in Djenné, so that was not his real name, sorry. His real name, I should have started with that, was Abubakar Siddiq Ouattara. And so I'll refer to him through the end of this talk as Abubakar Ouattara. So following his upbringing and his early years in Timbuktu and Djenné, the young Ouattara traveled to Bouna, which is located in today's northeastern Côte d'Ivoire, an important regional trading and intellectual center. And he went there to visit his late father's grave. He describes Bouna as a place of dwelling for many learned scholars who are not natives of one place, but each of them, having quitted their own country, has come here and settled. While there, he also had an opportunity to further his own Quranic education and schooling. And as he was getting ready to leave Bouna and embark on a journey eastwards to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, along with one of his teachers, a war broke out. Ouattara was captured. He was taken to neighboring Bondunku, which you see here closer to the coast, and from there to Kumasi, and later to a small port near Cape Coast, where he was sold to British slavers and taken to Jamaica. This would have been in the year 1805, and he was around 15 years old. He spent 30 years in captivity in Jamaica, before an encounter with an Irish judge in 1834 eventually led to his manumission. And within a few months of that manumission ceremony that I opened with in Kingston, Jamaica, Ouattara embarked on a London-bound ship. The journey would take him from Kingston to New York, New York to London, London to Gibraltar, and eventually he made his way down from the North Africa's coast down to southern Morocco. And It's in southern Morocco around 1836 that we lose his trace. We don't really know what happened to him. He may have died. He may have returned. And in fact, some records and some rumors that emerged in the region a few years later suggest that he did perhaps make it back to Timbuktu or to Djenné. And so what I just outlined, we know about it mainly for two sets of sources. The first set of sources is an autobiography that he himself wrote from Jamaica in 1834 upon meeting that judge, that Irish judge. He writes it in the Arabic language. The autobiography is then transcribed and translated immediately in English. There are multiple versions of it in English. The Arabic original to this day is lost or not known to be extant. And then the second set of sources that tell us about this man, Abubakar Siddiq Ouattara, is the writing of some of the people he encountered, including during the Morocco leg of his journey, a British traveler by the name of John Davison, who hired him as a guide for an expedition to Timbuktu, the place he was hoping to reach, and who, alongside whom he traveled for several months in Morocco. And so this British traveler writes his travel journal, and as part of that, you get a lot of information about Abu Bakr as well. So I've been following the fascinating journey and life history of Abu Bakr Ouattara from Timbuktu to Djenné, Djenné to Jamaica, Jamaica to Gibraltar, and eventually southern Morocco, and perhaps from there back to Djenné for several years now. And going back to the theme of this panel, West Africa and the world, I mean, Abu Bakr's story kind of like, even with all its holes, with all its silences and uncertainties, even with how patchy the historical record is around him, still embodies still makes for a very compelling example of a historical character that embodies precisely what we're talking about today in this panel, right? The kind of global connections that tied West Africa to other parts of the world. We're talking about someone who experienced multiple diasporas, who experienced multiple types or witnessed multiple types of slavery, when he was in Jamaica, when he was in Morocco, when he was during his upbringing in West Africa. We're talking about someone who experienced multiple modes of race making and whose trajectory squarely illustrates the West African Sahel's location at the intersections of the worlds of the Atlantic and of the Sahara. But for the remainder of this presentation, I'd like to turn to something different, which is how do we think about dislocation, the kind of dislocation that he experienced, dislocation from one's kin, one's environments, the distance, the diaspora, the disappearance, and intimacy, the making and the rupture of the intimate ties that bind people, not from the perspective of those who were taken away, like Ouattara, but from the perspective of those who stayed. And in that case, of his mother. So to do that, it's necessary to go back, to get back to his mother. It's necessary to go back and to have a look at, that world of the West African Sahel, the West African Sahel's place in the world from the perspective of the mother, who did not, as far as we know, go through this Atlantic crossing. And so to do that, we have to go back a little bit to what we glean about Ouattara's kin and family from the document that he wrote. That's I meant to show that earlier. This is an example. This is a picture of the manumission certificate that he signs that day in Jamaica, and you see at the bottom left his own signature in Arabic, where he says, "Wa ismi Abu Bakr Siddiq." My name is Abu Bakr Siddiq, signing right next to the judge, and that's the document that declares him officially free in Jamaica that day. So what does he say about his family? So I'm reading from the autobiography. Before all these things happened, my father used to travel about. He went into the land of Katsina and Bornu. There, he married my mother and then returned to Timbuktu, to which place my mother followed him. I'm going to skip a few things from what you see on the screen. He then ordered his slaves to make ready for their departure with him to visit his brothers. They obeyed him and did so, and went to the town of Djenné, and from there to Kong, and from there to Buna, where they stopped. There they abode and continued to serve him, collecting much gold. So in his interactions with white abolitionists and Orientalists in Jamaica and in England, Abu Bakr Ouattara is very adamant to present himself as the product of a privileged upbringing in a wealthy and politically powerful Sahelian family. The people around him describe him as some kind of like member of the aristocracy, a person of exalted rank, a nobleman in his own country. And this is an image that he's very himself adamant to feed, at least in his writing. And so it's important to go back to this a little bit and what we can understand about the kind of family environment he came from. It seems his father and his paternal family in general had deep ties to the state of Kong. Kong was a West African state which for a period in the late 18th and early 19th century held under its tutelage some of the major trade routes and hubs of the Sahel. It's located in partly like the north of today's Côte d'Ivoire. And by the 1790s, when Ouattara was born, Kong stood as a very powerful West African state, built and safeguarded through military force, and it eventually reached its apogee in the mid-18th century. Gonna skip a little bit because I see that I'm short on time, but you have to imagine, so, and Kong is run by Jula rulers, and the Jula, this class of merchants from this part of West Africa, that it seems Abubakar Ouattara's father belonged to as well, are part of networks, trading networks that sprawl kind of across the region. They go on the road, trading all kinds of commodities, all kinds of resources, and the rulers of Kong are very adamant to protect the traders' class's lucrative activities. And it's in this context that we can place his father. His father was definitely involved in slave trading. He talks about the slaves that his own father owned, all the work that they did for him, and that kind of fits within that environment that we can place his father, him as a powerful member of the Jatigi class of merchants in Kong. And so, thank you for the huge signs. That's. I will make sure to keep to that. So the father likely held a prominent status and had many possessions. And according to Ouattara in his document, he made frequent presents of valuable objects to Ouattara's maternal grandfather, so the father of his mother, who was a Katsina-based merchant named Al-Haj Muhammad. He calls him the Haj Muhammad Tafsir in the document. So let's turn now to this maternal side of the family and see what we can understand about it and can understand about his mother. Ouattara doesn't say much about his mother in the document. In fact, mentions of her and of the siblings, of his mother's siblings and maternal family only appear in one of the versions of his translated autobiography, the second one that he writes from London. In the first one that he writes from Jamaica, there's no mention of his mother. And this is what he says. So he's talking about his father initially, all his trades and all his travels. And he says, "My father collected much gold and sent much of this to his father-in-law, together with horses, asses, mules, and very valuable silk garments brought from Egypt, with much wealth as a present to him." And so now he turns to talking about his maternal grandfather. "He was my mother's father. His name was Al-Haj Muhammad Tafsir of the countries of Borno and Katsina, both inhabited by his family. My mother's name was Nagodi, that is, in the Hausa tongue. But her real name was Hafsa. She was born in the city of Borno. Her father, when he went to perform the pilgrimage, left her mother suckling her, on which account her name was called Nagodi." Okay, so from these excerpts, some of the things we gather was that his mother was from Borno, was a Hausa woman, that she was, according to him, an infant when her father went away to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. And that later in life, she had children with his father. I mean, she met his father, Karamosa Ouattara, a long-distance trader from Kong. She went away with him and settled with him in Timbuktu and then in Djenné. We also learn through the autobiography that his mother had 3 children from his father. So himself and another boy and another girl. Okay, that's my sign that I have 2 minutes. Thank you, Bernie, 2 minutes left. See, I had it too, though. I was on side. Okay. And we also know that his father had other wives and other children. And then once settled in Djenné, speaking from the perspective of Hafsa now, the father of her children went away for his trade activities and died. We know that he dies when he's away. And a few years later, at least one of her children, Abu Bakr, went away too for schooling and disappears. So what to make very briefly of the intimate bonds and effective geographies that shape the life from Hafsa, and what to make of what her son says about her in a document that's a document very much designed for a specific purpose, which is not just to tell his life history, but to write a document that he intends as kind of a passport to be able to make it back to West Africa, that he writes from the Caribbean. So Hafsa lives and moves through the intermingled networks of two trading diasporas, we might say, the Jula and the Hausa. And as such, mobility, distance, and absence shaped much of her life. Pilgrimage sent her father on the road, at least allegedly, and so defining an event in Abu Bakr's recounting of it that he would have shaped the nickname that she's given. She formed an intimate relationship with a man that sent her on the road, and she was taken away from her community, settles with him in Jenne, and then this man leaves. This man leaves, so trade and commerce sends the father of her children on the road, leaving her in this foreign place. And a few years after, and he dies, and a few years after that, education and schooling sends another one of her children on the road and leads to his disappearance. And we can assume that they never got to see each other again. And in the world of the early 19th century West Africa, where mobility was fraught with all kinds of risk, like the very real risk of somebody disappearing or being taken away, we can ask questions about what her sense of self, her sense of intimacy were, and how deeply connected they would have been to the idea of mobility and trans-regional network, even though she's not the one who technically, quote unquote, left West Africa, but still like had huge experience of mobility in her life and mobility of her loved ones. The same can be said about her son, of course, and as I said, he offers kind of like a perfect example of showing how connecting the region is, but I think it's very important to like stay in there and think of how she would have thought about the world and West Africa and the different worlds that were intersecting in there. The second and the last point, quickly, who was she? And specifically, was she a wife or was she a slave and concubine? And here I'm following a path that Harmony Workhard asks the same question in her own book, but that's a very important one, right? Because embedded within Abu Bakr's writings and silences about his mother are very blurred lines of intimacy, of spatial distance, but also of possible bondage. He never states that she may have been a concubine, and this certainly would not have been in his interest with the kind of self-fashioning that he's trying to do, that would run counter to it. However, the name that he mentions, Nagodi, as being the name of his mother, the name that she was given, meaning that she was still suckling her mother when her father left for pilgrimage, also has a possible meaning according to other scholars, some Hausa scholars. That is the name of a female slave given away to a person as a gift, which would completely reshape what we know about what he says about the encounter between his parents, the relationship between his father and his maternal grandfather, and how the two came to meet and how she came to follow his father to Jenne. And I have many more things to say and questions to ask, but I'll try to keep to time, but just, and we can discuss more in the Q&A, but just really, if we think about the connections between the region and the world, and the various worlds, again, that intersected in that region of West Africa, thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who experienced huge mobility, but not in the same magnitude or in the same distances as somebody like Abu Bakr Siddiq, who ended up on the other side of the Atlantic, also gives us a very different perspective on how the region was connected to the world and how West Africans in the early 19th century experienced diaspora, experienced distance, and experienced intimacy. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cham, for that fascinating transatlantic, trans-Saharan history. Next, we have Dr. Nana Osei Opare. Dr. Osei Opare is an assistant professor at Rice University and historian of African Cold War and international histories. Through the words of everyday people and the intellectual and political elite, his first book project, Socialist Decolony, Black and Soviet Entanglements in Ghana's Cold War and Decolonization Projects, which is contracted with Cambridge University Press, tells a new history of Ghana's Cold War. Dr. Osei Opare, welcome.
Hi, good morning. Before I start, I would love to thank Professor Achebe. About 5 years ago, she let through one of my articles, and that's helped me a lot since my career in Jawa. So I'm very thankful for that, and for the team, Caitlin, Ryan, Lucio, for organizing this. I did a conference 2 weeks ago, and I know how tiring it is. So thank you for doing this. In this talk, I want to highlight two Ghana Soviet projects and spaces: the Cotton Textile Mill and the Soviet Geological Survey Team, which I might say for short SJST. These were meant to represent the literal and metaphorical rupture from the colonial past and reflect a new imagined socialist decolony. As anthropologist Andrew Apter notes, these scientific technical projects were part of a broader effort to reject a return to African origins, an Africa that existed prior to European contact, as the only way forward toward final African emancipation and self-determination. While the Soviet-sponsored cotton mill and other economic initiatives in Ghana were supposed to embody Ghana's new post-colonial socialist modernity and highlight the benefits, opportunities, and options of Soviet partnership, these dreams never fully materialized due to fights over worker safety, environmental issues, financial sourcing, and political will. Consequently, in some sense, the never constructed cotton mill represents what I call phantom Second World collaboration and the failure to unite post-colonial optimism and rhetoric with action. However, these Ghana-Soviet spaces create new forms of knowledge and permitted the social, cultural, and political economic architects of Ghana to fashion a new socialist society and hopefully lasting African liberation. Moreover, the working poor in Ghana employed Ghana's Soviet spaces and the idioms of Ghana's socialist project to orchestrate, highlight, lambast, and challenge ethnic favoritism and discrimination, to contest who had power over their bodies, and to challenge who could financially benefit from these sites. Indeed, the Ghana Soviet space was sites of contested liberation and Black freedom. As historian Abna Dav Asari mostly argued, Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, sought scientific equity and fought for Ghanaians' access to global science and technology. For our purposes, the Ghanaian government pinpointed the Soviets as crucial to realizing their industrial and socialist ambitions. In '62, the Ghanaian government eagerly awaited the arrival of 5 Soviet technicians to survey Tamale in northern Ghana for 2 months to collect information to build a textile mill. The Ghanaian government picked Tamale as a preferred site for cotton production because it sat comfortably within Nkrumah's government's amalgamated liberational modernist socialist visions. Putting the mill in Tamale would at once readdress British underdevelopment in the region, provide jobs to an area wrecked by unemployment, open up the area to more industries, and provide power and water supplies for future industries and nearby residents. However, Tamale was not a uniformly popular site to host the mill, especially for the Soviet engineers. The same reasons the Ghanaians provided for the mill's necessity to be in Tamale, lack of power and water supplies, were the same reasons the Soviets gave why the mill should not be in Tamale. While the Soviets remained doubtful of the Ghanaians' proposed location, the Ghanaian technocrats remained skeptical about the Soviet mill's designs. They voiced their concerns in the local vernacular of neocolonialism, a term that held much currency and circulation within Ghana at the time. They remarked that Ghana would need to import 2,100 tons of cotton yearly to produce 20 million square yards. In addition, in order to bleach, print, or finish the gray cloth, the Ghanaian-operated mill would need to send the material to a British firm in the newly constructed coast city of Tema in southern Ghana. These steps, they argued, would further put Ghana within the neo-colonial economy before it could break free, which would realize Nkrumah's greatest fear. Outside of neo-colonial concerns, debates over worker safety stalled the project. Ghana's chief medical doctor, a British guy actually, called C.S. Hoffman, denounced the Soviet plan for failing to protect the workers from bisonosis, a lung disease causing asthma or chronic bronchitis and emphysema, which arose from inhaling cotton dust, particles, flax, and hemp. The Soviet chief engineer's proposed mill structure also lacked any daylight, so there'll be no windows in this new building, and favored using luminescent light and air conditioners to ensure greater worker productivity, in the Tamale heat. He said that this plan is what they used in other factories in the Soviet Union, Japan, US, and India, that they all lacked sunlight provisions. However, Hoffman scoffed at these ideas, arguing that using those kind of lamps would create more problems than they would solve, such as radioactive fallout and mental troubles for the workers. Then there was the small issue of factory waste, which had not yet been addressed. C.K. Anand, the chief Ghanaian engineer in Tamale, remained concerned about how and where the factory's waste would be disposed, amplifying calls for the creation of a proper sewage system in Tamale more largely. Yet, towards the end of '65, after 3 years of negotiations, surveys, and discussions between the Ghanaians and the Soviets to build the mill, the factory remained little more than a fanciful blueprint. So now shift to the next space. Ghana had an expressed policy to rigorously exploit all mineral resources of the country to bolster rapid development. Like its dreams of cotton independence, Ghana linked the Soviets to its vision of mineral independence. In December '58, Ghana welcomed Soviet scientists and diamond experts to explore how best to streamline and tap into the nation's natural resources. According to the British, the Soviets insisted they were going to Ghana to, quote, to Ghana to find the minerals which the imperialists have missed, end quote. They also been particularly interested in doing a deep geological exploration of Ghana's known magnesium or gold, cement, and salt deposits. Historian Asif Siddiqui notes that the Soviets used the term scientific research as an euphemism for basically prospecting the resources of the people. Moreover, historian Robin Divenon, sitting right here, argues that such work was predicated on the ritual geological knowledge of local African interlocutors and prospectors. Solovyov, the Soviet geological chief specialist, admitted as much, knowing that the Soviets would be exploring, quote, already known deposits to find out the expediency of detailed prospecting there, end quote. Despite the misgivings of some Ghanaian technocrats, the Ghanaian cabinet officials stressed the importance of collaboration between all Ghanaian stakeholders and the Soviets to make the SGST team, this Ghana-Soviet space, a success. Ghanaians also urged the Soviets to send in their best professionals to Ghana to ensure the project's success. While some Ghanaian technocrats found the surveys redundant and unnecessary, other officials in areas that needed more development pushed for their regions to be included in the survey. They believed that the Soviet intervention would procure benefits to their people, such as elevating chronic water issues, and basically supply towns and villages with clean drinking water. Yet, while some officials believed the impending Soviet geological team would benefit their community, farmers operating around these areas were going to lose their crops and potentially their livelihoods. The state placed the burden on those affected to, quote, collect all claims and pass them on to Land Secretariat for verification, end quote, and hopefully compensation. As the cotton mill's progress was stalling, the Ghanaian government pushed the Soviet geologists to follow their timeline and guidelines. This was part of a larger attempt by Ghanaian officials to extract the maximum work and benefit from the Soviets. While the Soviets wished to provide preliminary reports after 3 years, the Ghanaians said they wanted it after 1 year. Ghana was in a rush to unlock its economic potential and hopefully its freedom. While many of Ghana's writers, politicians, and leaders had placed great expectations and expended tremendous political, literary, and financial capital into the success of the Ghana-Soviet projects, they had always been very wary of the Soviets' ability to deliver. They had always suspected that if the projects failed, the Soviets would blame them for their own internal failings. Ghana's director wrote to its principal secretary of Ministry of Industries in June, have the quote that it is realized that the Russians will be held solely responsible for the success of their own work. Occasional visits will be paid to discuss technical problems, but the actual on-the-spot supervision may amount to interference. They, the Soviets, might not hesitate then to blame us, being the Ghanaians, for their shortcomings, end quote. As these projects came to a standstill in the final years of Nkrumah's reign, historian Alexander Iandolo notes and accepts this idea that the Soviets insisted that it was the Ghanaian, quote, incompetence that lay behind the project's inability to become a reality. The Ghanaians' premonition had become a reality. It also become a lesson for other African states and foreshadow future African-Soviet relations. Historian Maxim Masurovich notes in the early 1970s, Nigerians, frustrated by Soviet slow progress in building the Ajukutu steel mill, know that, quote, they had to profit from the Ghanaian experience and subject the Soviet experts to rigid control and supervision, end quote. Nigerians went on to remark that, quote, only after such measures had been taken did the Soviet survey of Ghana begin to produce results, end quote. I shall conclude. From a material standpoint, the Ghana-Soviet space stopped existing after Nkrumah was removed from power, thanks to the CIA and some rebellious troops. It is then easy to read what I call ghost projects as markers of failure, indications of African or Soviet incompetence or inability to realize the dreams they envisioned. Yet, as Betty Banks, Robin Divan, and Siddiqui urge us, they're just to resist the urge to read the Africa-Soviet modern as a failure, but to think of it as an aspirational world, a space of possibility through its material outcomes. They maintain that the incompleteness of the Africa-Soviet modern represents a kind of theater of unbounded aspiration, where its principal actors, students, planners, scientists, activists, and diplomats, could play out their small roles in a grand and iconoclastic desire for futurity. Can't pronounce that word, end quote. In fact, yes, as my larger chapter and then work shows, development projects were left to the figures on the periphery. It was these small figures, the town planners, lorry drivers, district commissioners, security guards, who were the engines and interlocutors of the state's foreign policies and socialist agenda. And while the cotton mill was never constructed, and the Soviet Geological Survey team did not produce the results the Ghanaian authorities rarely wished. Those same Ghana-Soviet spaces, and I can discuss this later on in the Q&A, and how, became arenas where everyday Ghanaians, especially those marginalized within the Ghanaian socioeconomic landscape, could contest and expand the parameters of socialist citizenship and Cold War dalliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osei Opari, for that deeply textured read of the Ghana Soviet cotton textile mill. Next, we have Dr. Jody Benjamin, an associate professor at Howard University. Dr. Benjamin is a social and cultural historian of Western Africa with expertise in the period between 1650 and 1850. His research is informed by a methodological concern to center the diverse experiences and perspectives of Africans in ways that transcend the limitations of the colonial archive. His first book, The Texture of Change, Dress, Self-Fashioning, and History in West Africa, 1750 to 1850, with Ohio University Press, explores questions of state-making, social hierarchy, and self-making across parts of Mali, Senegal, and Guinea through the lens of textiles and dress. Welcome, Dr. Benjamin.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you to Dr. Chebe and to the other MSU organizers for inviting me here. And it's been great to be in the space of such wonderful scholars on this occasion, and also to be celebrating with you, because it feels like you're also growing, right, and expanding. And so I'm happy to be here in that context. So the title of my talk is Paths Toward Decolonial Knowledge Production, the Ethics of Archival Practice, Research Methods, and Publication for Historians of West Africa. And so we've already heard some exciting projects and had an interesting discussion this morning about the AI projects. And so these are my thoughts that are sort of contributing to this conversation we've already kind of started this morning. So archival documents of the West African past are dispersed across continents, national boundaries, languages, and institutions that document a diverse range of historical actors from the 18th and 19th centuries. Merchants, farmers, sailors, caravan guides, Islamic clerics, enslaved artisans, free artisans, nobles, kings. These various experiences reflect global connections, incipient diasporas, both internal to West Africa and transatlantic, and West African social transformations that too often get simply flattened as pre-colonial. Yet West African historical experiences of migration, dislocation, and reinvention are as continuous across the temporal divides of pre- and post-colonial as they are across the spatialized binaries between West Africa and its multiple overseas diasporas. But what can decolonial approaches to that history look like, and how do questions of method and sources get us there? Part of the afterlives of Atlantic slavery and colonialism in West Africa, of course, are the institutional structures, the archival collections, and the decades of accumulated research and writing from them that have shaped not only how we conceive of our work as historians, but the possibilities for how we conduct research and disseminate our work to others. For me, to produce decolonial histories of West Africa means to begin to question how knowledge about the past can be accessed, read, and interpreted in ways that do not reproduce the coloniality of state archives that we are trained to rely upon for research. How can our practices of research and publishing avoid reproducing the extractive aims of the colonial state? In what ways do our practices contribute to building a West African future free from the economic and epistemic legacies of colonial rule? Black feminist scholars of Atlantic slavery have critiqued the gendered violence, erasures, and silences in the Archive of Atlantic Slavery, housed in state collections throughout Europe, the Americas, and Africa. They have been at the forefront in advocating that scholars seek ways to exceed the epistemological limits of such collections, and an important work towards decolonizing history along these lines is also to move beyond conventional periodizations of West African history to instead center timescales that reflect the evolving relationships between West Africa and its diasporas. And so I'm very much thinking about the paper that we just heard in terms of multiple diasporas in the Sahel in the 18th century, and that this continues evolving in multiple ways across time and space. To what degree should the work of historians of West Africa be in dialogue with that of historians and other scholars of the African diaspora and those working in Black studies? To address these questions of research, writing, and practice, I will draw from examples of 3 specific scholarly interventions that I have co-led in recent years in California, the Netherlands, and in Saint Louis, Senegal. In each of these venues, scholars, researchers, and students and artisans came together to engage with questions of the archive, knowledge production, and pedagogy. So the first example comes from a Mellon seminar titled On Archiving Blackness that brought together an interdisciplinary group of Africanists, Black studies, and African diaspora scholars for a series of conversations about the role of archives in our work. That was at the University of California, Riverside in 2021 and 22. Similar questions of method have long preoccupied scholars in our respective fields, focused on centering local marginalized or silenced perspectives of Africans and their descendants. The imperative to look beyond the methodologies and epistemological concerns of Western historiography has also been generatively explored by Africanist scholars, drawing on an archive of African-derived sources, such as Adrami manuscripts, proverbs, oral traditions, ritual practices, local landscapes, and material culture. This can be difficult, creative, and time-consuming work, requiring the exercise of multiple skill sets. And this raises questions about the additional intellectual, physical, and financial challenges that historians of Africa pursuing these lines of inquiry face, which are not just about visiting archives and reading documents, but encompass a holistic set of other attempts to learning about the past. So at Archiving Blackness, an early focus of our discussions were the ethics of our archival practices, taking seriously the implications of what it means to work in archives created in the context of Atlantic slavery and colonial extraction of African labor and resources. We interrogated our relationship to the archives that we rely upon and queried our accountability to the people documented there who experienced the violence of dehumanization, decommodification, and various forms of coercion. Rather than an extractive process, we theorized a research practice of reciprocal relationships between historians and the descended communities whose past we research. We imagined a research practice in which the historian did not work in isolation, but rather normally worked in collaboration with a range of community stakeholders and knowledge producers. And this is some of what we've been hearing about this morning. But at that conference, Sion Wald-Michael shared the collaborative research methods developed at the Center for Restorative History in Washington, where she is co-founding director. And that center scholars work with communities impacted by systemic oppression to co-develop research questions, to identify archival sources together, both institutional and otherwise, and to identify also local experts who jointly conduct research and construct historical narratives that aim to give voice to silenced perspectives. This approach, which we discussed at the time, would have to be carefully adjusted to work within West African national or even transnational contexts. but it suggests ways historians might collaborate with the communities they research in the sort of larger goal of working towards or advancing forms of social justice. The second example that I have comes from another group of scholars working transnationally, and that was a week-long seminar organized by the Humanities Against Borders Project of the International Institute of Asian Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, which brought together scholars, graduate students, and artisans from a dozen countries across the Global South, the US and Europe, to explore the transnational histories of textiles and dyes, with Leiden, the historically important Dutch textile city, as our archive. The point was to frame graduate students' approach to advanced research and the framing of their research questions to be in conversation with a range of stakeholders beyond the academy, such as textile artists, practitioners, commercial entities manufacturing and distributing Dutch wax print textiles to markets around the African continent, to museum curators of ethnographic examples of textiles, and including migrant communities from different parts of Africa in the Netherlands. In this way, students were able to connect their research questions about a particular material, such as a textile or dye, to broader questions about ecology, indigenous knowledges, violence, dispossession, and the creation of diasporas, both historically and in the present. And then finally, my third example, thank you, is coming from Senegal, and recognizing the importance of doing this work in West Africa. I participated in a similar set of dialogues in the colonial city of Saint Louis, where the architecture of buildings themselves are colonial artifacts that attract global tourism, visitors whose traffic to the island, in fact, feeds a local handicraft industry in which local artisans create Senegalese or African objects that are meant to appeal to foreign visitors with cash to spend. But what does it mean to Senegal's rich artisanal craft heritage that its contemporary manifestation would be so heavily oriented towards these foreign tastes and foreign buyers? Does this not reconstitute a colonial export economy, this time with cultural objectification as the main commodity? So the question for us there was, in what ways can scholarship and knowledge sharing about artisanal crafts in Senegal, from glass bead making to pottery making to textile weaving and dyeing and wood sculptures, intervene by centering the labor expertise and creative life worlds of artisans, both past and present? So that conference, Craft as Method, brought together a transnational group again that included both scholars and artisans that have been described, to explore all of this in dialogue across geographic, linguistic, and disciplinary boundaries. And indeed, my own work on the history of textiles in Western Africa shows that the history of craft production can also be histories of technology, histories of labor, and indigenous forms of science, perhaps when explored through community-engaged collaborative research. This can be brought forward, and these sort of histories can be further explored to explain the rupture between a variety of local knowledge systems and the colonial science and educational systems that came to replace them and to essentially marginalize them. So I offer these few examples here as contributions to an ongoing dialogue about the research direction of the humanities scholarship more broadly from my perspective as an Africanist historian working from North America. And all of these projects and this work, of course, unfolds against, thank you, 2 minutes, unfolds against the backdrop of a neoliberal global economic order in which the funding for humanities research and education is constrained in many parts of the world, and also leaves in place stark inequalities between scholars working in industrialized and developing countries. So I will, okay, let me just try to go through this quickly. There's a sense in West Africa, this problem that I just described in terms of stark inequalities exacerbates an already wide gulf of disconnection between the work that scholars do to produce historical narratives and broader public awareness. And so I just described, there's been a couple of kind of dramatic incidents in the past few years of archival collections being burned or attacked during political kind of disruptions that don't really center on the documents, but the documents become an object of some people's rage, and really suggest this sense that the documents themselves are this tool of oppression that sort of needs to be confronted. And so this is also part of the context in which we work. And so these are matters that no single historian can remedy on her or his own, and yet each of us individually has some relationship to this situation. We find our own solutions and pathways through this thicket of ethical thorns and institutional challenges. It strikes me, however, that we are also in an important moment of possibility of experimentation and innovation, and that historians should take full advantage of it, even as we seek to reimagine the future of history as a decolonized scholarly practice and public discourse. For that, I think historians need to be more thoughtful and intentional in research methods that are collaborative and that engage with multiple communities as part of the research process. When we answer the questions, who is my work for and for whom and to whom am I accountable, we should know that the answer includes many constituencies besides other scholars and also beyond our own borders. We will, of course, continue to write the journal articles and publish the monographs because this is our principal work as scholars. But I think that our responsibility as historians of West Africa in a world shaped by slavery and colonialism really ought to extend beyond that practice. We should normalize the practice of publishing our peer-reviewed findings in as many ways and in venues as possible, and also as many languages as possible. And we know the difficulty of that work, but I also just want to sort of bring it to our attention as something to think about and to be intentional about. And so with that, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, for that fascinating paper on the importance of digital collaborations and of centering local voices and ways of knowing. Up next, we have Dr. Harry Odompton, who will take the threads that have been presented to us on this terrific panel and weave them all together into one intricate cloth. Dr. Odompton is an associate professor of African and Atlantic history at Santa Clara University. He holds, we're very proud to say here at Michigan State University, a dual PhD in African American and African studies and history from right here in East Lansing. Go Green. Dr. Odompton is an intellectual and social historian and has recently published Edward W. Blyden's Intellectual Transformations, Afro-Publicanism, Pan-Africanism, Islam, and the Indigenous West African Church.
Well, thank you very much, Walter. I think in the last panel, it was very clear you didn't come to listen to the discussants. So I'll say very little, but I will start that off by telling a story about the Ga compound on which I grew up, where there was a conflict between a couple and they brought it to the elders to decide. It was decided that the woman in the relationship had abused the husband, so she should apologize. And when she was asked to apologize, she said, in my language, "Nona akenke," which means what they said I should say. She didn't apologize. She just said, well, they say I should apologize. So what they said I should apologize about, and did not offer. So I'm just here to say what they said I should say. West Africa and the world. The panel is West Africa and the world, diaspora, Pan-Africanism, and global connections. I think there's no gainsaying to say that West Africa has had a long engagement with the world in different time periods to a group of historians, West African historians. But what the presentations do have together is this various cities and places in West Africa connected to the world. As you can see in the presentations, Accra, Tamale, Jenei, Timbuktu, Jamaica, connected to other parts of the world. I want to start with the first presentation about textiles, and textiles has been one of the ways in which West Africa has engaged with the world, either receiving textiles or sending textiles out, even in the way that we see intra-African exchange of textiles in the story of Abubakar Siddiq Ouattara, as Madina Cham explained in her presentation. And I think that the history of textiles opens up, like Jody would say, many pathways to migration, trade, histories of craft, histories of professional societies and associations, labor, technology, and so forth. So in general, it gives us a deepening understanding and history of indigenous West African knowledge systems. But the approach that Jody took was to think about decolonial approaches to the archive or the coloniality of the archives. And he used what he terms as the Black Feminist Scholarship Archive or approach, and advocates for dialogue between African based scholars and students and Western based scholars. And also using an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to that inculcates old and emerging subfields. So what I would like to ask is if he can elaborate on this sort of collaborative work in the community as he advocates, as it applies to his own work on textiles in the region, and how that could perhaps help on training our students from this colonial engagement with the archive. Nana Osei Opari's presentation, I am very familiar with because I've read a lot of his work. But I think the heart of his presentation, I want to quote from his work, says, around 1960, a public project commenced in Ghana to reorient and reintroduce its population to the wonders of the Soviet experiment and what lessons the new state might draw from it. Ghanaian newspapers praised the quality of Soviet goods, industrial development, and technical experts. And then a little further down, he says, pro-Soviet and Eastern Bloc stories, that is the narratives, were not simply intended to offer hagiographic praise or to support Nkrumah's commitment to geopolitical non-alignment. Instead, they were part of a concentrated movement to dismantle and deconstruct the myth of Western scientific and cultural superiority and anti-Soviet bias, which were introduced and reinforced by Western colonial education and rule. So that's the heart of his presentation. I wanted him to maybe elaborate a little bit more on the idea of scientific equity as taken from Abena Osei Asari, and also these idea of Ghanaian Soviet spaces. I think that in his presentation, he sort of pivots to look at the Nigerian Soviet situation. So maybe is there any possibility of expanding the optics to include other Ghana, not Soviet, but Eastern sites or spaces. So you mentioned Ghanaian Soviet spaces. So if you could elaborate on that, but also other Ghanaian spaces with other Eastern Bloc, like I think about the Ghana International Trade Fair Center, for example, that had the African, the round pavilion and how it was built with Ghanaian Polish architects and so forth. And then different places in Tamale, the Tema oil refinery and other places, how perhaps you could expand your optics to include that. And then Medina Cham's presentation from Mecca to Jamaica gives us a brief history of intimacy, maybe a history of emotion, as a way of entering into the history of the Sahel. And there's in many ways very similar to the stories of Abdurrahman Soria, Job Ben Solomon, and others. But I think that the story also opens us up to the idea of diasporas. So this is somebody who grew up in a Monday diaspora, I would say, but experiences other forms of diaspora as well. So maybe we could, if Walter comes back here, maybe you could talk about some of the transatlantic slave trade databases. How are we going to categorize this person who was shipped from the Gold Coast? So is he going to be from the Gold Coast cultural region? Is he going to be from the Senegambian cultural region? How are we going to categorize them in some of the databases that we have, having experienced all of these geospatial experiences? All right. So I would end my submission here and say in another meaning for Nagode. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Do you each want to respond very briefly to Harry's comments? We'll start right here with you, Medina.
So the idea of diasporas, multiple diasporas, and how do you categorize that person? Is that, yeah, no, I think that's really key to his story, right? Because I guess the reason, and you're right, the sort of narrative about his own life that Abubakar Ouattara writes has a lot of echoes with other texts that we know about. Like there's the recent book on Omar ibn Said. There's, as you were saying, Abdurrahman. Like we have a lot of these stories. Something that they show is the kind of complexity of the path inside West Africa before there's any kind of diasporic dislocation to speak of, right? You see the complexity of his story. You see, and again, he traces the paternal line, the maternal line. You see the intersection of multiple diasporas already. And so, yeah, I guess that's a big challenge for us and how we write about this, and how we write about these people, how we name them. That's the first, I think so. There would be a temptation of naming him as a Jula, as an enslaved, Muslim person from a Jula background, and there's probably a lot to be said about that. He anchors his trajectory very much inside Timbuktu, which makes sense, but which also evokes kind of different worlds that you would. And then there's this whole maternal line, right? We don't know what languages he spoke with these various people, what language he spoke with his mother, what language he spoke with his father, the language that he spoke once he got to Jamaica. So no clear answer, but really, I agree. There's this. I think it's really a task that is done upon us to figure out how we can name these people and remain clear while not oversimplifying also how complex their diasporic trajectory was, even inside West Africa.
Thank you. Nana, you have a very brief comment or reply?
Yeah, I don't know about that. Because actually,
we have a stop sign back there if we need it.
Thank you. I apologize. I didn't say the private or what I sent him. That nice part. So thank you for bringing that up. I think for me, thinking about the Ghana Soviet space, it operates in multiple levels. So there's the one he mentioned where it's a theoretical level where the press is talking about if the Soviets can do that, we can do that too. In other Eastern European countries, it did it within 30 years. So we can do it too. And we don't need the West to do that. So that's that sense of we can do it too. There's the other level where it's the actual physical space. So whenever there's a Ghanaian or Soviet person, so that could be in present-day Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia, where they interact at the Soviet space, and there's fights both physically as well as scholarly about what's happening there. And then, yes, I do think I can broaden it out to Africa's Soviet spaces, and even Romania appears in my text as well as one of these sites. You mentioned Nigeria. And then for Abna's frame of scientific equity, part of the challenge of the mill was there was enough power in Ghana, and how would you actually power this factory? And Nkrumah, of course, is trying to build the dam on the other side. And so when I think about scientific equity, is a lot of times we think about the dam as this new colonial project, but in fact, they understood that this was going to power all the other industries being built simultaneously. And so also infrastructure of equity, the Soviets were not the only party that wanted to build the mill in Ghana. The Germans, the Israelis, the Italians had all, a Jamaican company too, had all pitched proposals. But the reason why they picked the Soviets wasn't because of a leftist idea, was because the Soviets also said they were going to train the Ghanaians in some of these techniques. And that's why they went with the Soviets for that project. So it was all intertwined. Sorry, I know that was long.
Thank you. Jody?
Great. Thanks for the question about how does this actually work and look like on the ground. I would say that, so I am thinking about this and coming to this after finishing my monograph, which was an extension of my graduate school work, which was completed in a kind of shooting from, it feels like a kind of shooting from the hip, learning as you go kind of experience. And so I'm at this point now of having finished the monograph and thinking, well, what would this look like if we sort of conceived of this, in a different way from the beginning, and also conceived of the sort of funding paths and how you sort of build relationships as a part of, like, if I had to sort of do my book again, like, conceive of a series of relationships that unfold together across time and space. And I think part of the challenge, one of the things I'll just say also is that, sort of teaching students and kind of it's very difficult to bring these earlier periods into their kind of awareness and conversation. And yet there are questions that they have. And I know that there are questions that students in Africa have, and they're related. But this kind of idea that it just feels like it would be great if there could be more communication, and we have the means to do that, and to sort of think about that communication as sort of a part of how we do what we do. So that the monograph is obviously very important, but I also feel that like this monograph that I'm about to publish really there should be more to it, right? That there should be other ways to communicate what's in it, and to engage with people. So this is kind of what I'm sort of after in thinking about this.
Thank you, Jody. I'm sure you all have questions. Bernie has a microphone. I would ask that you raise your hand. Bernie will hand you the microphone. Please introduce yourself, and the panelist will respond. Folu.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed all of these presentations. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
I really enjoyed all of these presentations. I have a question and a brief comment for Dr. Is it Nomani? No, the first presenter. No.
Medina.
Medina, yeah. Thank you so much for that fascinating story of Boubacar Siddiq Ouattara. I have a question and a brief comment. And the question is there anything that we can learn from Boubacar's experience as an enslaved person in Jamaica that reflects or connects the story of his enslavement, his experience with his own paternal history in the Sahel? Did he reflect on that in any of his writings or autobiography? So that was my question. And I'm thinking of the book I read by Howard French, 2021, on Born in Blackness. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the book.
Born in Blackness. Howard
Yeah,
French.
okay. Yeah.
You know, Africa, Africans, and the making of the modern world from 1450 to, I think, you know, I forget when it stopped, 18 something. Anyway, but so I was thinking of that book as I was listening to you. So I wonder if you connected any of his experiences as an enslaved person with his background and his life, you know, before he was enslaved. And with respect to the intimacy that the story of the intimacy you're exploring from his maternal side, I'm intrigued by the story of his mother. His mother, he says, Hausa, and was from Borno Empire, from Katsina. And given the nature of the gifts, you said, Abubakar's father, elaborate gifts he frequently sent back to the wife's mother. Hafsa Nagode, he said, is her name. Something tells me that the nature of that exchange went beyond his relationship, I mean, simply marrying the woman or have taken Abubakar's mother from her father as a gift. Because Nagode in the first place, as you know, in Hausa language means thank you, right? And I think in this context, that thank you is a much more nuanced, represents something that's more nuanced, especially as a father named her Nagode about the time he went to Mecca and came back. And something also tells me that her father occupied a very powerful position in the Borno Bogo Empire, El Kanemi Emirate. And the nature of the relationship between the Jula and the Fula and the El Kanemis, you know, suggests that that woman was not just a gift to Abubakar's father, but also was part of an elaborate exchange between these two kingdoms.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So do we want to answer individually or take several together?
Can you take several? Okay, let's take several questions. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Next one, we'll take three. So
thank you so much, presenters. I really enjoyed all presentations. I have two concerns, methodological concerns and ethical concerns based on, you know, the state of the field. So particularly for methodology, I'm thinking of Medina, if you allow me first name basis.
Yes.
Medina, you know, it's very illuminating, your research, but as you noted that this story is told through the men around her. So how do you approach reconstructing Hafsa's life given the limitations of historical sources, you know, in the context of the stories around her, right? I guess I'm thinking of how, as a researcher in this field, how do you balance these male-centric narratives about a woman, right? You know, to center her experiences. And also, how do you mitigate potential bias and limitations, which is real for sources that you explore, you know, considering also that Abubakar's autobiography is one of the very few limited sources in this subject matter. And lastly, thinking of diasporic space now, how do you navigate the challenge of telling a history of the Sahel that includes Atlantic entanglement and connections on one hand, you know, without overemphasizing that particular Atlantic experience at the expense of local and regional dimensions of the narrative? So I guess, again, managing home-based with diasporic base. Then importantly, for ethical concerns, I found Jodi's work very interesting, especially because of the kind of sources I deal with myself as a historian. So I just have one question bordering on that. I wrote it down. So, so what ethical considerations do you think now come into play when we develop digital archives? In this sense, you know, when we develop these kind of archives, how do we ensure that these kinds of projects, are not commodified, by the non-academic space for perhaps commercial gain? So how do we kind of bridge that challenge? Thank you so much.
Thank you. One more question for Nana. Does anyone have one over here, please? And then we'll have the panelists respond. We have until 11:30 is our hard stop.
Thank you for this great panel. My question is for Jody Benjamin. You raise up really great questions about how to collaborate more between those in the North American space and on the continent. But I wonder what role class plays into that, and the type of institution you are in, and the many ways that scholars have to secretly, unsaid, work in ways that may not often be, within the institutional structure. So for example, I'm at a public institution. If I want to hire someone to translate my work, my institution says, do they have a bank account? Do they accept checks? No, they use mobile money. So, but because I'm so invested, I use my own money, my own personal money, to pay thousands of dollars for someone to translate. But I also understand I'm not early on tenure track, and this is something that I'm I want to do. So I find that class on both ends plays a really critical role. Thank you.
If I can add a question to Dr. Oseopare, because I think everybody at least gets one, and I'm the man with the microphone, so
and you have the microphone.
So we've heard that the Ghanaians looked to the Soviets for certain skills, certain technical expertise, and they identified this. Were the Soviets looking at Ghanaian cotton as something specifically desirable for their textile sector? Was there something special about Ghanaian or Sahelian cotton that made them want to be involved in this as well?
Okay, let's start here and we'll work our way down to answer the questions, and then we'll end the panel. So
Okay,
go ahead.
it is 11:27. So I'll try to be very brief. Yeah, and I don't think I can do justice to all the questions, but I'll come speak also with you directly. Okay, great.
11:40. Okay, we have plenty of time.
We'll be- Okay. Okay, Professor Ogudimu, thank you for the questions. What can we learn from his experience as an enslaved person in Jamaica that ties back to his background? Not a lot, because there's not a lot that he reveals and says about his experience as an enslaved person. In fact, he's very careful in the narrative that he writes to talk a lot about his family background, his experience up to his enslavement, of the enslavement itself. Immediately following the conflict that leads him into the situation, he's actually quite silent. So there's a few things that we know. We know that he was employed as a bookkeeper employed by the last person who accepted to sign these manumission papers, because he would keep records and accounting in Ajami, actually in Ajami, like Afro-Jamaican Ajami. So making use of his own literacy skills to write in English and keeping track of accounting with this in English in the Arabic alphabet. We know about some correspondence that he had with somebody else who was enslaved on the island, also from the region of Kong, a man named Mohamed Kabasaranogo. And we know, so there's one letter that they exchanged that's written in English because it's mediated by this Irish judge, but at the bottom of it he writes, if you want to write to me and for me to understand properly next time, write to me in Arabic. But this next time and this other records, we don't. So we can sort of try to trace some of that background, how it translated into his experience in Jamaica. But his experience, the 30 years he spends in Jamaica, is actually the part of his life that through the historical record, we know the least about. So that becomes very, very tricky. I'm going to try to fuse, I guess, several of the questions also with some of what the questions that Bright raised, because I think it's very important. Believe me, it's the stuff that keeps me up at night as well, including, is this even worth? So I worked for several years. This is an offshoot also of my PhD dissertation. And these chapters were squarely on the story of Abu Bakr and his own trajectory and all of that. It's only, as often happens when, filing all of that away, refusing to look at the dissertation for several months as I was, recovering from all the trauma and everything, and then going back to it. that I realized that that's actually the part that deserves a lot more exploration. But I did ask myself the same question: is it worth trying to get at the story of his mother through an account that is mediated, as you said, it's mediated by men, but also not just any man, right? Because I don't think Abu Bakr writes this story because he wants to talk about his life. He writes it because he's in Kingston, Jamaica, and he's trying to convince a bunch of people at the Royal Geographical Society in London that he can be hired as a guide to take them to Timbuktu. And as I said, that's kind of like his passport to go back. And so he does a very deliberate kind of like self-crafting and self-fashioning that adds yet another layer. So the story of his mother is mediated by him, but also by the, again, all these guys sitting in London deciding, can we hire him as a, and so you're right, it does pose a lot of these problems. So I think one way to not solve it, but get at it, has to do with how we then write. I don't have any pretension that I can actually write a story of his mother. I don't, based on this autobiography anyway. I'm sure there are a lot of other sources that can hopefully be harnessed, and it goes back to the previous comment about who was the maternal grandfather, what records did he leave, what kind of histories can we reconstruct based on that, understanding the relationship between the father and the maternal grandfather. All of that can help. On the basis of Abu Bakr's autobiography, there's not much we can learn about his mother, but there's a lot of questions we can ask. And I think just the fact of asking these questions and trying to reread, not just reread the text, but also reread the region from her perspective and all the gaps, actually highlighting all these gaps and these silences, that still does something. And acknowledging precisely what you said, that we actually cannot fully get at her story through this text because there's just so much missing. And that's just to the last comment about the Atlantic entanglements and not overemphasizing them in the history of the Sahel. So that's definitely part of the book, because that's one of the things that I want to show, that not just in the coastal regions of West Africa, but when you go deep into the Sahel, like when you're in Timbuktu, in all of these places, these Atlantic entanglements are still very much present. But that's not it, indeed, as we see in this trajectory. And so the rest of the book very much highlights, through other family histories like that, and through other family entanglements, also connections between, like among various cities in the region, between like today's Mali and parts of today's Ghana and part of today's Nigeria. So it's not just that Atlantic side. It's also looking at the other side. But thank you very much. I really appreciated the questions and the comments.
Thank you. Nana, 3 minutes to respond to the question.
Yeah, thank you. So what did the Soviets hope to get from helping Ghana build cotton? So the Soviet Union itself, pre-Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, part of their colonial conquest of Central Asia was the creation of cotton growing spaces in Central Asia. And so the Soviets were trying to export their own colonization ideas that we've taken a backward place and made it into an industrial modernization space. You can do the same in Tamale, which in the Ghanaian lexicon, the North is also this backward space that needs to be developed. And so this is where these two ideas come together. The idea of where the cotton would be used was supposed to be for Ghana, because Ghana itself has a huge cotton consumer base. And so the goal was to tap into that base and use that. And foreign companies saw that from 55 before independence. So that was what they were trying to do. So, and I would also say part of the narrative is that the Ghanaians only get from the Soviets scientific technical help, and it's a one-way street. They really only go to the Soviet Union to see their industries, but the Soviets also, when they're in Ghana, are exploring Ghana industries to see how the Ghanaians also do it. So it's a two-way knowledge transfer there. Yeah.
Thank you. And Jody, you will wrap this up and send us off to lunch.
Bring us in. Let's see. So the two questions that were directed to me were about, they're sort of related in a way. One about the ethical considerations of historical knowledge being potentially commodified. And then another sort of the question about class and our class positionality. I don't have an answer to the first, although I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm sort of imagining a situation in which historical knowledge, there's a market for it, right? And so I hadn't thought about that problem, but it seems to me that I guess my answer to both would be we need to sort of make these kinds of issues visible and talked about and sort of thought about intentionally from the beginning, because if there's a market for that, like a sort of commercial market for that, then what does that say also about a potential audience that could be sort of engaged with in a non-commercial way? But sort of bringing out that that the sort of economic relationalities that are happening right on the side here and in various places in West Africa, and the same thing in terms of bringing attention to and sort of deliberately talking about class. And I feel like there's a lot of work that a historian of West Africa does that is sort of extra, unpaid, not really acknowledged as work, etc. And so that's also part of what I would argue a process of decolonizing is sort of we need to sort of think about how this stuff gets done and who does it. And we've soon seen examples of sort of bringing that into the conversation. But I guess I'm just trying to think about how we can be even more intentional and deliberate and articulate that and ask that question constantly. So that's how I would answer this.
Thank you. Can we thank our panelists for this wonderful panel?